Welcome to the 8th in a series of 20 devotionals in the Lent and Art Devotional series by Kelly Bagdanoff. In this devotional, there are two basic parts. The first is called the reading. Every painting tells a story, and we need to read the meaning. In this part of the devotional, Kelly will provide the needed items of background that will help you to read the painting. The second part is the contemplation. Kelly will give you some guidance, but she really wants you to engage with the painting and let it speak to you. We cover 20 paintings in the whole devotional. The subject for this video is a painting entitled The Kiss of Judas by Giotto. It is a part of a fresco that covers the entire interior of the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, Italy. Thanks for joining us on this tour of Lent and Art, and here's Kelly.
Today's Lent devotional is The Betrayal of Christ, or The Kiss of Judas, by Giotto. To read this painting correctly, it's important to know its context. This painting doesn't stand in isolation, but is one masterpiece of many in a grand cycle of paintings that is unique in the history of art. In a northeast corner of Italy is the city of Padua. Even in 1303, Padua was a cosmopolitan center boasting a prestigious university. One of the residents was a man named Enrico Scrovegni, a successful banker, and by that I mean he practiced usury, charging criminally high interest rates, and had accumulated a great deal of wealth. Due to this, the Scrovegni family was notorious, so notorious that when Dante was writing his Divine Comedy, he reserved a special place in the seventh circle of hell for Reginaldo Scrovegni, Enrico's father. Enrico, in a bid to improve his family's reputation and perhaps save their immortal souls, built a church. The church was located next to the family palace, which was built over an ancient Roman arena. Thus, the Scrovegni Chapel is commonly referred to as the Arena Chapel. By building, decorating, and staffing the church, Enrico hoped to redeem a bit of his family's honor and earn God's approval. He even had himself painted into the Last Judgment, presenting the chapel to the Virgin Mary. Giotto, an artist from Florence, had earned a name for himself and was commissioned to decorate the interior of the chapel with fresco paintings. It's important to understand that this painting was painted in 1303 to 1305, which is a couple hundred years earlier than any of the other works we've considered. Giotto lived before the Renaissance, in a time when art was dominated by the Byzantine style and when the Gothic influence was moving into Italy from France. Giotto's genius is that he combined the two styles and added additional innovations that would forever change the course of art. While we might find his art stilted compared to the other artists that we've looked at so far, Giotto is a proto-Renaissance artist. He ushered in the changes of figurative realism that would lead to the flowering of the arts during the Renaissance. For 1,000 years, painters had been using the medium of paint to visually write stories. Yes, they were often beautiful, mystical even, but they were meant to communicate and teach the biblical narrative and to direct believers' hearts to God. With a great deal of the population illiterate, churches wrote with pictures and frescoes the great truths of the Bible. However, artists were constrained by the fear that graven images would lead believers into worshiping false gods, and so they used restraint, painting in stylized ways that avoided too much realism. And this is the reason that Byzantine art is not more realistic, and why it was popular for so long. Over time, the ability to be able to represent more realistic figures was lost. The leap that Giotto made might be more understandable if you have a clear picture of how artists worked during the Middle Ages and why painting had remained largely unchanged for hundreds and hundreds of years. Artists were skilled craftsmen. They were apprenticed as teen boys to a master, and they would start out sweeping and fetching, move up to prepping walls and panels, and eventually learn to draw and paint from patterns. All artists worked from pattern books, and aspiring artists would spend hours working to learn to reproduce the patterns. When a painting was commissioned, patterns from the book would be arranged into a prescribed space or frame and made to fit the story. Of course, Some artists might become interested in something and add an original drawing, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Instead, each master had a workshop, and when he took on a large commission, those who worked for him would paint the portions that he designated to them. And it's very difficult to determine which portions of a painting are actually the master's brushstrokes and which are the artist working under them, because they all worked from the same pattern books. And while painting the Arena Chapel, Giotto actually had 40 men from his workshop painting with him. So we need to get rid of the idea of an artist sitting with a sketchbook on the beach, sketching the ocean, just his mind and the picture in front of him. That process was going to come much later. In this era, artists did not draw what they saw. They drew what they had been taught to reproduce. So some were very skilled at it, but it was a learned craft, and it was approached differently than how we typically envision an artist working. Giotto was trained in this same way as artists had been for centuries. However, Giotto was inspired by the new Gothic sculptures that he was seeing, and there was no one to train him to transfer that realism to painting. He was now stepping out beyond what he knew, beyond what anyone around him knew. He imagined in his mind now expressions, gestures, movements. He put himself in the role of Jesus and asked himself, how would he walk? What would he look at? And he noticed and attempted to reproduce a more real world. This was very different. His changes were noticed, and viewers who saw his paintings felt they were watching the sacred stories play out. They were no longer looking at heavenly scenes that bore little resemblance to their lives, but instead they were viewing real individuals living lives they could relate to. To our modern eye, Giotto hasn't achieved realism, but in his time, he had begun a revolution. When Giotto got the commission for the Arena Chapel, he must have been thrilled with the interior of the building. The outside, while tall and powerful, is very austere and seems to stand in direct contrast to the colorful beauty that awaits you when you enter. There are 6 tall windows on one wall, and that is all there is in terms of architectural detail. This gave the artist a wonderfully large blank canvas to fill. The theme of the chapel, unsurprisingly, was salvation, and it focuses on the life of the Virgin Mary, the life of Christ, and the Passion. On one of the end walls is the Annunciation, and on the opposite is the Final Judgment. As you can see, there are 3 bands of paintings. The highest band is the life of the Virgin Mary, the central band is the life of Christ, and the lowest band is the Passion, or Christ's final week and resurrection. The chapel is considered one of the supreme achievements of Western art. This is not an overstatement, but universally agreed on. Giotto was a true genius, and the chapel was done at the height of his career. One entire building covered from floor to ceiling with one work after another, all by one artist, providing a unified narrative experience. Each of the paintings in the bands winding around the chapels are 6.5 feet by 6 feet. It's hard without actually walking into the chapel to imagine the impact of viewing one masterpiece after another around and around the room. Today, we're going to focus on just one of the works from the cycle of Christ's Passion, the Kiss of Judas. It's also known as the Betrayal of Christ. These paintings are all frescoes. Fresco means fresh. The area to be painted in a day was prepped with a thin layer of plaster, and while it was still wet, the artist painted with watercolors on it. And the pigments then soaked into the plaster, and as it dried, the paint became part of the wall. The paint did not just sit on the surface. If you scratched a fresco, the color would remain true as the pigment was in the plaster itself. Because of the way that frescoes are created, they literally are part of the building. They can't be moved. They present challenges in terms of restoration. Fortunately for us, frescoes generally hold up very well to advancing time, so walking into the Arena Chapel is as awe-inspiring today as it was in Giotto's time. There are a few things that have changed, however. The blue pigment used to great effect in this painting was very expensive, and so it was painted dry. The intensity of the color was lost, or one had to use a lot of the pigment when painting a fresco because it would soak into the wall. So since the blue pigment was so expensive, it was painted when the plaster was nearly dry. This was also true of gold and silver. They would be added on top of the fresco after the wall had dried. That explains why when we look at Giotto's works, the blue paint is prone to fading. It's sitting on the surface of the wall, and so it has come off. Additionally, silver has presented challenges. The background of this work, you can see, are a lot of black helmeted figures. These were not originally black. They were painted with silver, which has oxidized over time and turned black. So we have to remind ourselves as we view these that these paintings were done over 700 years ago. As we study this painting, one of the first things I'm aware of is the sense of movement. This is a violent, chaotic crowd that is surging toward and around Christ. Giotto has left the top half of the painting dark with the night sky. This emphasizes the clubs, lances, and torches that the mob is carrying. If we follow the lines of these, we see that they cross and intersect and go off in angles, creating a violent rhythm in the sky that affects how we view and feel about the painting. We note that one person in the crowd is blowing a horn, which adds an audio note to the scene. We can imagine the clamoring of metal and boots as the soldiers and the mob approach, and the sounding of a horn in a crowd like this feels like a call to battle. We have one figure down in the front with his back turned toward us. This is a common device used by Giotto as it draws our attention. This figure is such a large, solid block of blue that he is very noticeable. We know that he's reaching out to grab the cloak of a disciple who is fleeing the scene. The gospel accounts tell us that during Jesus' arrest, the disciples fled. And in Mark's account, we're even told that there was a young man who, when a guard reached out and grabbed his clothing to detain him, threw off his clothes and ran into the night naked. Now, we know that the person being grabbed by this blue figure is a disciple that's been caught because we can see the edge of his robe, a little slice of his face, and a halo. We only have 3 figures with halos in the painting: Christ, Peter, and this disciple that has been caught in the act of fleeing. Giotto suggests that there are narrative elements going on outside of the picture frame by showing us action that is half in and half out of the painting. This is a relatively new device that artists were using and that Giotto is exceptionally good at. Framed by the blue cloaked figure is a vignette of Peter slicing the ear off of the high priest's servant, Malchus. We know from the accounts that Jesus rebukes Peter, saying, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Now, as we look at the second line of individuals in the painting, so we have across the painting people that are in the front, and the people that are just behind all of the people in the front, we see that there's a line of red that marches from one side to the other. The color is a symbol, that color in general is a symbol that Giotto was very adept at using. In his day, color and symbolism in painting was communication. The original audience would be able to read multiple and layered meanings in Giotto's works. Red can mean many things, and those meanings can alter depending on the surrounding colors and the context they're painted in. Red can refer to blood, humanity, danger, and threats. In this painting, all of those meanings apply. Obviously, Christ is being threatened and his life is in danger, so that applies. And beyond that, when talk about Christ's blood, we're talking about the source of our salvation, and he's being arrested to be taken to the cross, so blood fits the picture. And we see this line kind of snaking behind people through the whole painting. Now, a deep red, like that on the soldier, also indicates power. And as we continue looking at the painting, we come to a figure in pink who is pointing. One should always pay close attention to people pointing in a painting. It's a not so subtle hint that we should be paying attention. And so he's painting to the central characters in this drama. This figure's in a darkish pink robe trimmed with gold, and his head covering is green. Now, green can be thought of as a positive color. It's associated with life, particularly with nature. But sometimes green has a negative connotation. Just as nature has seasons and is constantly changing, the color green can be used to indicate a transitory or ambiguous nature in a person. The green head covering is used here on one of the Jewish religious leaders to indicate his nature is not steadfast and loyal, but rather that his true nature is ambiguous and changes with the politics or the seasons, that it's transitory. Now, his cloak is pink, a shade of red, and that tells us that he represents a threat to Christ. Additionally, his actions make him guilty of taking part in shedding Christ's blood, so he has blood guilt, and we see that in the red of his clothing. Now, when we combine the red color of his robes with the gold trim, we know that he has a position of prestige and power. And combined with the guilt of having Christ's blood on his hands, we know that his power has been corrupted. Now, as we follow the figure's pointing arm, we come to the center of the painting. Along with the figure pointing directly at Christ and Judas, we also have all those lances surrounding their heads, kind of in a half circle, that are highlighting for us again the confrontation. Giotto has managed to create stillness in the chaos of the crowd. The trail, like a bombshell, has been dropped, and the rest of the world seems to fade away. And Giotto has captured the emotion, pain, and startling truth of this moment with emotional clarity. So in the middle of all of the chaos, we have this moment of stillness right in the center, as if Judas and Christ are in their own little bubble. Jesus communicates with his calm brow and steady eyes, both foreknowledge and understanding, a perfect picture of love confronting betrayal. In sharp contrast to Christ, Judas is troubled and frowning. Perhaps he's already regretting his decision. The two men who have been closely bound for several years seem to be just enclosed in this quiet, intimate space. That space is defined by the jaundiced yellow cloak that Judas has wrapped around them. Jesus is almost entirely enveloped in Judas's cloak, just as he will soon be enveloped by the sins of humankind. Now, yellow signifies treachery, deceit, and decay. In fact, in the 12th century, Pope Innocent III forced Jews and Muslims to wear a yellow badge to identify themselves as infidels because they were treacherous and deceitful. This is actually the source of the stars, the yellow stars the Nazis forced the Jews to wear during World War II. Now, that yellow cape is the center of the work, both physically and emotionally. The sweep of lines in the cloak direct our eye toward the two faces, so different from one another. One full of patient understanding, one already filling with self-loathing. The emotion that Giotto is able to convey in their looks is just astonishing. Now here I'm going to read an account of the arrest. While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns?" Then everyone deserted him and fled. Now, as we enter a time of contemplation of the painting, I want to ask you to focus in on the faces of Christ and Judas. Consider Christ. I think most people have faced betrayal in their lives, perhaps by a friend, family member, a spouse. We understand this pain and we can identify with Christ in this moment. We may marvel at the calm understanding on Christ's face, the miracle that he appears to love Judas still. If you have faced the pain of betrayal, I pray that you will find peace and healing, and that you can find comfort knowing that Christ understands your suffering and that he will walk with you through that pain. Lord, I pray that you will comfort those who feel they have been betrayed. Fill their hearts and minds with your peace and your love. Help them draw strength from your example and protect them from bitterness, loss of hope, thoughts of revenge. Bind up the brokenhearted and give them comfort. Consider Judas. We humans are very good at deception, maybe especially self-deception. I imagine Judas had reasons that he told himself for the choices he was making, that he'd rationalized his decisions. I'm sure he had internal arguments with himself that what he was doing was really for the best, that the other disciples weren't seeing things clearly, and if the religious leaders believed Jesus was a fraud, then they must be right. But when the moment came in this painting, and in that chaos, he looked into Jesus's calm, understanding eyes, all of his rationalizations and deceptions fell away, and he saw what he had done. He was laid bare and had nowhere to hide. That is the look I see on Judas's face. We've all betrayed Christ in a multitude of ways. Whether we have or not isn't really the question. The question is, have we allowed ourselves to look into Christ's face long enough for him to break through our rationalizations so that we can see with clarity ourselves, our actions, our hearts? Going by Judas's face, seeing ourselves clearly can be a painful process. Too often we avoid looking into Christ's face because our own sinfulness will become apparent to us. Our avoidance, however, is foolishness, as Christ knows our weaknesses and our failings, and yet he loves us. Christ's compassionate understanding is our hope. Lord, we come before you knowing that we fail, that in ways large and small, our words and lives betray you. Forgive us, Lord. Restore us. Lead our minds and hearts into your goodness. Unite our wills with your purposes so that we will prove faithful.
I love you, Baba.